Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Benjamin Watkins of Relay Theology and Christopher Kaczor, professor of philosophy, correct, at Loyola Marymount University?
Yep, that's correct.
All right. So we are discussing the question today, is abortion ever morally permissible? I'll have Dr. Kaczor introduce himself first very briefly, and then Ben Watkins.
Okay, as you mentioned, I'm a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and I've thought about this issue before, and so I'm looking forward to hopefully a lively discussion. And so let me begin by just saying that I think this issue, in order to think about it fruitfully, we need to first begin with the distinction between the act and the agent. And so what I mean by that is it's possible for someone to do an act that is morally impermissible, and yet for that agent to still be a morally good person. So in this whole discussion, at least for my part, I'm not making any judgment whatsoever about the people who get abortions or the people who support abortion. I'm not making any judgment about their character. I believe that someone might get an abortion or someone might support abortion in good faith. Now, I think when we carefully think about the issue, that it turns out to be the case that abortion actually is not morally permissible, but I recognize that people of goodwill and people of good faith can and do see things differently than I do. So let me put that aside. I'm not making any judgments at all about people's character, to look down on them, to put them down, or anything like that. Now, why do I have the pro-life point of view? Well, I think to think about the question properly, we need to start off with three fundamental questions. The first is this individual alive? The second is this individual a human being? And the third is, does this individual have a right to live? Or is it morally permissible to kill this individual? And by this individual, what I mean is the human fetus. So first, let's think about the question, is this individual alive? I want to emphasize here that answering this question, and also the question of whether this individual is human, has nothing whatsoever to do with faith, with religion, with theology, with the Bible, with Jesus, etc. A reasonable person, a person of goodwill, who's an atheist, can come to all the same conclusions that I'm going to come to in my part of the discussion. So this is not at all dependent upon religion or revelation or theistic belief or anything of the sort. So to the first question, is this individual alive? I want to appeal to science. If we look at the embryology textbook called The Developing Human in its 10th edition, we find these quotations: human life begins at fertilization. This marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. The zygote is the beginning of a new human being, that is an embryo. Now, why do scientists think that this individual is a living being? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is that it grows proportionally. Secondly, it assimilates nutrition. Third, it has functioning parts that exhibit a unity and function together for the good of the whole. It also responds to its environment and adapts to its environment. The human fetus is not a part of another human being. It is its own individual, unique, whole, living human being itself. Unlike, say, sperm, or unlike an egg, which are parts of other human beings, the human embryo and the human fetus are distinct organisms. It has a individual principle of operation by which it does the things that it does. So it would be an error to call the fetus a clump of cells. At least it's an error in the sense that if you call the fetus a clump of cells, you might as well call you or me a clump of cells. The fetus is not a clump of cells. The fetus is an organism. So this is shown in another way too. I'd like to appeal here to the science section of the Telegraph, and the headline on May 4th, 2016 from the science editor was this: human embryos kept alive in lab for unprecedented 13 days, so scientists can watch. Now, if human embryos can be kept alive, that means that human embryos are alive. It's impossible to keep something alive unless that thing first is alive. So all available scientific evidence confirms that the human embryo, the human fetus, is a living thing, a living organism. So now on to the second question. Is this individual a human being? Well, this individual has a human mother and a human father. This individual has human blood, often of a different blood type than the parents. This individual is constituted by human tissue. This individual has human DNA. This individual is on a path of human development. This is a human embryo. This is a human fetus. This is not a dog embryo. This is not a dog fetus. This is not a cat fetus. In fact, it is scientifically impossible for two human beings to get together and do a reproductive kind of act and have the result of that be an individual of a different species, right? A man and a woman who do reproductive acts cannot produce a goat, a dog, a fish, or any other kind of individual being. Two human beings doing a human reproductive act using their reproductive organs can only reproduce another human being. And in fact, both of these points, that this is a living individual and that this is a living individual human being, are admitted by almost all defenders, in philosophy at least, of abortion and infanticide. Almost all of them do admit that this is an individual living being, and almost all of them do admit that this is a human being. So where does the disagreement really begin? If we accept all the science, the disagreements begin with the third question: is it wrong to kill this individual? And so I want to give 6 different arguments that it is wrong to kill this individual. The first argument appeals to human rights. I believe, and the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights declares, that all human beings have human rights. And the most basic of human rights is the right to live. That is, the right not to be intentionally killed by others. So the human embryo, the human fetus, the human newborn, the human child, and the human adult are all human beings. Now, if you put these premises together, you have the conclusion that the human embryo, the human fetus, and the human newborn all have human rights, including the right not to be intentionally killed. Now, it's never permissible, at least on my view, to violate someone's basic human rights. Let me say that again. It is never permissible, in my view, to violate someone's basic human rights. It's wrong if a government tortures and kills an innocent person, even if they think it's going to serve somehow the greater good. Now, abortion violates the basic human rights of the human embryo and the human fetus by intentionally killing the human fetus and therefore violating its right to life, which is the right not to be intentionally killed. If we put these premises together, the conclusion follows that abortion is never morally permissible. Now, what if the human fetus is not a person? Well, we can consider the wrongfulness of abortion from another perspective. What makes it wrong to kill you or me? Well, if you kill you or me, it doesn't take away our past. I still have being a kindergartner, and you do too. But if someone kills you or me, what happens is it takes away my chance for a valuable future. And that is true of killing you or me, and that is also true of killing a human newborn. If you kill a human newborn, it takes away that newborn's chance for a valuable future. And the same thing's true of killing a fetus or killing a human embryo. They too, if they're killed, are deprived of their chance for a valuable future. So note, in this argument, I am not claiming anything for or against personhood of a fetus. So it's never morally permissible to deprive individuals of a chance for a future like ours. And abortion, as well as infanticide, is an action that deprives individuals of a chance for a future like ours. Therefore, abortion is never a morally permissible choice. Here's a third argument. It begins with fetal alcohol syndrome. It seems to me that it's wrong to intentionally cause fetal alcohol syndrome in another. Fetal alcohol syndrome, if you're not aware of what it is, causes very serious physical deformities, very serious mental health deformities. It causes mental disability. And some of the poor children who have suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome can't even count or read a clock in 7th grade. It's a very serious condition. Secondly, if it's wrong to impair an individual to a particular degree, then other things being equal, it's wrong to impair that individual to a greater degree. In other words, if it's wrong for me to poke out your eye and make you partially blind, it's also wrong for me to poke out both of your eyes and make you totally blind. If it's wrong for me to cut off your hand and deprive you of your hand, it's also wrong for me to cut off your whole arm and deprive you not only of your hand, but of your whole arm. So killing someone is inflicting upon them a greater impairment than fetal alcohol syndrome. Killing someone results in that individual's total physical destruction, whereas fetal alcohol syndrome only brings partial physical deformities. If you kill someone, you've taken away any chance they have of social life, whereas fetal alcohol syndrome just impairs social life. If you kill someone, you've taken away entirely their mental abilities, whereas fetal alcohol syndrome only partially takes away mental abilities. If you kill someone, they're unable to do anything whatsoever. But if you inflict fetal alcohol syndrome on someone, then they may be able to do some things, like, count once they're over age grade 7. So, a fortiori, it's worse to kill someone than to impair that person to a lesser degree. So, it's never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly give someone fetal alcohol syndrome. And if it's never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly give fetal alcohol syndrome to someone, then, other things being equal, it's never morally permissible to bring about a greater harm to that individual, that is, killing them. Therefore, it is never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly authorize someone to kill that individual, that is, the prenatal human being. A fourth argument has to do with social justice. It's never morally permissible to act against social justice, that is, to deny protection to or to intentionally harm the most vulnerable, helpless, and disadvantaged human beings. But the newborn and the prenatal human being are among the most vulnerable, the most helpless, and the most disadvantaged of human beings. That is to say, a newborn baby and a fetus is unable to voice their protest at being killed. They're unable to defend themselves in any physical way. They're unable to mobilize others to support their cause. So if anyone's a vulnerable human being, it seems to me a newborn baby and a human being in utero both count as vulnerable human beings. So it's never morally permissible to act against social justice, but to deny protection and or to harm newborns or prenatal human beings is to act against social justice. Abortion is an act against social justice because it denies protection and harms the prenatal human being, and therefore abortion is never morally permissible. A fifth argument that I want to provide is this: actions that intentionally kill innocent human beings are never morally permissible. And the act of abortion does intentionally kill innocent human beings. The abortionist aims at ending the life of the human being prior to birth. And that's why it's called a botched abortion. If an abortionist attempts to perform an abortion and the fetus is born alive, that's not a successful abortion. And so why do we call it a botched or unsuccessful abortion? Well, because the abortionist is aiming at not delivering a healthy baby, but at ending the life of the prenatal human being. A sixth argument appeals to the sad history of exclusion that unfortunately has been part of our society for many centuries. When we think about racism, what we see is one race saying that another race doesn't count as fully human, doesn't count as having basic dignity, doesn't count as having basic rights. When we look at sexism in its strongest form, we see that men say, well, women are misbegotten men. They're not fully human. They don't really count. They don't have full human rights. When we look at religious exploitation, we see one religion saying, oh, if you're of a different religion, you don't have basic rights and you don't count. If we look at European exploitation of native peoples, we see again the same sorry pattern where they say, well, you're different from us, and therefore we don't have to respect you. And finally, in slavery, we see the same terrible pattern where the slave owner says, yes, of course, I deserve basic rights and protections, but if you're the slave, you have none of those things. Now, every time that we've divided the human family into two groups, those that are like us, that have basic rights and deserve protection and deserve respect, and those that are different from us, that don't deserve respect, that don't deserve protection, every single time we've ever made this division in the human family, we look back on it and say that was a horrible mistake. That was a moral tragedy. So history shows it's never morally permissible to divide human beings into those human beings who have basic rights and those human beings who do not have basic rights. To deny basic rights to newborns, prenatal human beings, is to divide human beings into those human beings who have basic rights and those human beings who do not. So it's never morally permissible to deny basic human rights to newborns or prenatal human beings. So if it's never morally permissible to deny basic rights to newborns or prenatal human beings, then we have the premise that to get an abortion is to deny by your deeds the basic human rights of prenatal human beings by killing them. And so the conclusion would follow that it never is morally permissible to get an abortion. So what I try to do is basically bring forward a case against the choice of abortion. Try to bring forward a case that the choice of abortion is never morally permissible. And I made remarks that talked about the fact that science shows that the human fetus is a living organism, the fact that science shows that this living organism is a human being. It has human parents, it has human DNA, it has human blood. It can't be a goat, a dog, a fish, or anything else. And then I gave 6 arguments why we should respect and protect the life of these human beings. I gave the human rights argument, I gave the future like ours argument, I gave the fetal alcohol syndrome argument, I gave the social justice argument, I gave the harming the innocent argument, and finally I made an argument from the history of exclusion. That every single time we've ever divided the human family into those who have basic rights and those that don't, we've made a horrible mistake. And I'm very afraid that we are continuing that horrible mistake now by denying basic rights to our brothers and sisters prior to their birth. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kaczor. So I thought you were going to do your introduction, but you jumped into your opening statement, which is totally fine. No,
okay.
You're fine. You're fine. So I might give Ben like just 1 extra minute because I realized about a minute in, oh, Dr. Kaczor's doing his intro. So it's okay, his opening statement. So just to be fair to Ben. That. No, you're good. Yeah. You're good.
I did. Yeah, I misunderstood the directions, I guess. Okay.
No, you went in guns blazing, so that's great. Okay. You know. All right. Yeah, Ben, if you want to brief, for the audience's sake, yeah, basically, right now our speakers are going to give 15-minute opening statements, 15 minutes of cross-examination, 20 minutes of free dialogue, 10 minutes of addressing the questions that you've sent to me ahead of time, and then we will close with 7-minute closing statements from both of them. So Ben, do you want to introduce yourself or go into your opening statement?
Yeah. So just real quick. So I'm Ben Watkins of Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. And so I'm stepping out of my philosophy of religion comfort zone and into the domain of moral philosophy, or applied ethics, I should say. And so I'm really excited for the discussion, and I really enjoyed Dr. Kaczor's opening statement. So.
All right, Ben, when you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Okay, so I want to just lay out the problem of abortion or unwanted pregnancy. So many persons engage in sexual activity that cause pregnancy, and some were not intended, or they are otherwise unwanted pregnancies. Advances in medical technology have made possible safe, affordable, and easily accessible abortion procedures that can terminate a pregnancy by intentionally killing the prenatal human being, such that it is dead. A pregnant woman has both the ability to terminate her pregnancy by aborting it, or she has the ability to intentionally carry it to term, so far as she biologically is able to do so. A categorical pro-choice view insists both of these choices are always morally permissible. But a categorical pro-life view insists that intentionally killing a prenatal human being is always morally objectionable, such that a woman should, ought, or must not choose to have an abortion. On such a view, there is only one morally permissible choice, and that's to intentionally choose to carry a prenatal human being to term, so far as a woman is biologically able to do so. To be sure, there are also intermediate views that admit of exceptions. For example, a conditional pro-choice view admits there are times when having an abortion is morally objectionable. And similarly, a conditional pro-life view admits there are times when having an abortion is morally permissible. But which of these views is closest to the moral truth? So let me make some preliminary remarks here. It's difficult to arrive at a difficult understanding of the fundamental issue of abortion without philosophical concepts and methods. So we can be confident that any easy or obvious answers are likely mistaken somehow. Ignorance, confusion, and morally misguided narratives are potential pitfalls we can avoid only with careful consideration. It is no secret that the topic of abortion is politically charged. The cost of erroneous belief about the moral status of abortion is very high, because if abortion is morally wrong, but society believes that it is morally permissible, then the result will be the unjustified killing of many prenatal human beings. If abortion is not morally wrong, but society believes that it is, and therefore makes it illegal, the result will be much undeserved suffering, the deaths of many women, and an unjust limitation of women's freedom. We should care about getting the answer to the question of abortion right, and for the right reasons, so that we can craft the best public policy accordingly. It's also worth pointing out at the start some of our limitations. Our answers are inescapably part of our personal identities. I'm a feminist and my interlocutor is a Catholic. My view is progressive and he is conservative. My view is humanist and he is a theist. My view is pro-choice and he is pro-life. Additionally, we are both men who merely have windows into the problem of unwanted pregnancy and the angst a self-conscious decision to have an abortion presents to a woman. There are undoubtedly aspects of this question that are forever beyond both of our understanding and appreciation, regardless of what level of impartiality we are capable of achieving. Next, and I really cannot overemphasize this point, is what is commonly known as the distinction between is and ought, or the is-ought gap. We both concede a fetus is a biological human organism, or prenatal human being, and that it is alive in the sense that it can be killed such that it is dead. The question of when a fetus is biologically alive is morally irrelevant, and whether or not it is a biological human or a member of the species Homo sapiens is beyond dispute. These considerations are irrelevant to answering our question of whether a prenatal human being has a right to continued existence, because they are merely predicates about the way the world is. These scientific claims do not tell us about the unique moral nature of these is facts. That is relegated to the domain of ethics, moral philosophy, or ought facts. We cannot infer how the world ought to be in a moral sense from facts about the world that are merely descriptive in a non-normative sense. We could know all of the properties of some act that are discoverable by the natural sciences, but we would still need to make an appeal to substantive moral facts if we are going to say anything about the moral properties of such an act. That's because there is a metaphorical gap between normative or ought facts and non-normative or is facts, such that this distinction is sharp. These are two non-overlapping domains of facts. Much like facts about rivers could not be the same as facts about sonnets, moral facts could not be the same as non-normative facts. Why do these preliminary marks matter, though? I believe that any strength a pro-life view has depends on either dubious moral assumptions or ambiguity in our language. For example, our concept of murder presupposes, often without notice, a wrongful killing, and the term baby is ambiguous or a vague predicate. A baby may or may not refer to a person, and the use of the term murder may or may not presuppose the concept of wrong within it, depending on how it's being used. Hence, claims like it is wrong to murder an innocent baby are morally ambiguous because they may be confused, or our use of language may gloss over important moral distinctions and assumptions that beg the question one way or another. You may notice that I'm using the phrase prenatal human being to refer to a human fetus. This is not an arbitrary choice of language convention. This is a preferred phrase of my interlocutor that he believes helps us see things more clear. I'm trying to use that same language game so we can minimize conceptual confusion and ambiguity of language as much as possible. I'm conceding my opponent's preferred language game, parsing out all of the relevant and irrelevant concepts and claims, and then I hope to challenge my interlocutor in his own terms. My aim is to remain as true to a dialectical or otherwise Socratic method as much as my own psychological and otherwise biological limitations will permit me. To wrap up what is almost surely too many preliminary remarks, I want to emphasize that I'm defending a categorically pro-choice view that insists abortion is always morally permissible. I will make this case in two parts, such that even if my categorical pro-choice view falls short, we will still have some justification for the view that at least some abortions are morally permissible. Additionally, I intend on making this case using as much common ground as possible with my interlocutor. My aim is not only to show why the pro-choice view is closer to the truth, but also how the pro-life view is making some mistake. I've already mentioned in my preliminary remarks, there is no way to make a moral judgment about the issue of abortion without also appealing to substantive moral facts or true claims about what matters in a moral sense. There are deep disagreements, though, about which moral claims are moral facts and which are mistaken, and these disagreements constitute some of the deepest fault lines within moral philosophy. For example, a substantive moral assumption of mine is that procreation or the intention to get pregnant is not a necessary condition for morally permissible sexual activity. A woman may find herself facing the problem of an unwanted pregnancy through no action in which she would be morally blameworthy for performing. In other words, women do not deserve to have to face the problem of an unwanted pregnancy, nor could they deserve the trauma of choosing an abortion. This moral assumption implies that unwanted pregnancies are a state of nature that are intrinsically undesirable, such that we all have sufficient reasons to want to eliminate them so far as we can. This is not the only substantive moral disagreement we may have, though. I also believe that bodily autonomy, or the freedom for a woman to choose what is best for her body, is in itself a good thing or something we all have sufficient reason to want to preserve for its own sake. Perhaps my interlocutor would concede these moral assumptions with some sort of qualification or recharacterization. But my point is that these moral assumptions constitute some of our deepest disagreements and are what can make this question so difficult to really get at. What we are looking for is some moral principle that would decisively settle the question of abortion that all parties could concede. Fortunately, there is such a substantive moral common ground between us. We can specify substantive moral fact that we can both easily concede. Intentionally killing a person is a wrong-making property of an act, such that we have a moral duty not to intentionally kill other persons so far as we can, because persons, and only persons, have a right to continued existence. This is a principle no one could reasonably reject. Everyone could rationally will, and it would not be disallowed by any principle no one could reasonably reject and would make things go impartially best, such that we should, ought, or must act on it. In the argument that follows, this will be the only substantive moral assumption to which I will appeal. What I'll primarily be defending is the well-worn personhood argument. The essential claim of this argument is that intentionally killing a prenatal human being is not a wrong-making property of an act. Prenatal human beings are not persons and so do not have an intrinsic right to continued existence, or what is often called a right to life. Therefore, a prenatal human being does not have the property of being something we ought to allow to continue to exist. This argument immediately raises the philosophically deep question, what is a person? I argue that a person is a persistent subject of experience that is psychologically unified by self-conscious thought and memory. A person is not merely a potential subject of experience, nor are their experiences merely psychologically connected by unconscious mental states. They must be an actual subject of conscious experiences that are psychologically connected. A prenatal human being does not have a right to continued existence unless they are persons in this sense, but they are not persons in this sense. Therefore, a prenatal human being does not have a right to continued existence. Therefore, intentionally killing a prenatal human being is not a wrong-making property of an act. General rights are properties of persons that we should, ought, or must respect, or they otherwise count in favor of our responding to them in a decisive or categorical way. But what must be the case for something to have such a general right in the sense that we owe it to each other? If something is to have any rights like these at all, then there must be something that is in this thing's interests. To be in something's interest presupposes that it also has conscious desires, or the arousal of impulses towards other things. Conscious desires imply intentionality, or a conscious directedness towards other things. Intentionality implies a persistent subject of conscious experience. The right to continued existence implies psychological unification, and psychological unification implies self-conscious thought. To drive this point home, I want to use a more recent thought experiment on the scene. Imagine there's a burning building, and you only have enough time to save either a young toddler or 1,000 frozen embryos. Which should we choose to save? Most people's moral intuitions are that we should save the toddler rather than the 1,000 frozen embryos. But why? I believe the answer is because we immediately recognize the self-conscious desires of the young toddler that the 1,000 frozen embryos simply do not possess. So we simply do not have this obligation to 1,000 frozen embryos like we do to a toddler. I argue that it is these properties which constitute personhood and a right to continued existence. We've been asked today to answer the question of whether abortion is ever morally permissible. So far, I've laid the groundwork for a categorical pro-choice view that insists all abortions are morally permissible. But what if I'm wrong about personhood? What if I'm mistaken about prenatal human beings having a right to continued existence, and some abortions are morally wrong for this reason? I want to now argue that this is not the case, and we can use a famous thought experiment from the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson to make the point that even if a prenatal human being has a right to continued existence, that right does not imply the right to someone else's body. According to this thought experiment, you wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood, as well as your own. If he is unplugged from you now, he will die, but in 9 months, he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. It's important to realize at the start that this is not some analogy between prenatal human beings and a violinist. The point of this thought experiment is to show that someone's right to continued existence does not imply a right to use someone else's body. In this case, the violinist does not have the right to use your body, even though he has a right to life. A mother has the right to withdraw the use of her body, even if a right to life is involved. If this is correct, then it follows that even if a prenatal human being has a right to continued existence, such a right is sufficiently outweighed by a mother's right to her own bodily autonomy. So I'll go ahead, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll go ahead and stop there. I think it's about 15 minutes.
Yeah, you have like about 30 seconds left if you want to use it.
No, I'll just go ahead and yield whatever time I have left. Maybe if I go over later, just I'll eat that time up.
Credit him 30 seconds on the flip side, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, of course. All right, so now we're going to go into cross-examination. Dr. Kaczor, you have the floor to ask the questions to Ben.
Okay, so just to clarify how this works, is the idea that I'm asking him questions and then he'll get a chance to ask me questions?
Yeah, so you're asking him questions right now for 15 minutes. You can kind of press him.
Would it be better to just have an open dialogue, maybe? Would you rather do that, Dr. Kaczor? Like,
No, it's fine.
So
let's stick with the format. Yeah, no, that's
cool.
Let's stick with the format, because then I can question you about what you said, and then you can question me about what I said. That might be a fair way to.
Yeah, Socratic dialogue. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good.
Yeah, don't worry. There'll be time for a free dialogue.
Yeah. So Ben, thank you for your remarks. First, I want to thank you for acknowledging the scientific and medical facts about abortion, rather than obfuscating things and pretending as if there's just a clump of cells, there's no individual living organism, this living organism isn't human. And another thing you did not obfuscate, which I appreciate, is that, if I got you correctly, that abortion is intentional killing of a prenatal human being. So I appreciate all that. We don't have to argue about stuff that I think there's tons of scientific evidence in favor of. So where do we disagree? Well, I appreciate the agreement, but I do disagree with some of the things you said. So it is true that we're men, but I'm not sure that's really relevant for thinking about the issue of abortion. As you know, one of the classic fallacies in philosophy is called the ad hominem fallacy. And the ad hominem fallacy is where you try to discredit someone's view by means of noting their personal characteristics. So you say to a woman, well, what do you know about this? You've never, had prostate cancer. Well, yeah, your female doctor may have never had prostate cancer herself, but that does not show at all that she doesn't know what she's talking about. I think that the pro-choice side should be very careful in using this sort of ad hominem argument saying, well, men shouldn't speak about abortion, in part because in the United States, abortion was legalized in Roe versus Wade by the opinion of 7 men. So I just think we can't get into ad hominem arguments against one another and say, well, you can't speak on this because you're black or you're Asian or you're white or you're a man or a woman or you're trans or whatever. That's just ad hominem. So let's set that aside. I'm not sure I agree with the idea that to be human is irrelevant for this question. And partly the reason I don't agree with that is I am not someone who's I'm skeptical that speciesism is really morally impermissible. In other words, I think that someone's species is morally relevant for determining our actions. For instance, I think almost everyone can recognize there's an important difference between eating a hamburger and eating a Harold burger, right? Eating human flesh, almost everyone agrees, is morally different and distinct from eating, say, the flesh of a cow. I think we can recognize, and most people do, that having sexual intercourse with a human being is significantly different than having sexual intercourse with an animal. Another thing that you mentioned is that the intention to get pregnant is not needed. I want to agree with that. I think that's right. But maybe, yeah. Okay, maybe I can ask you about this. One of the things you said is that even if the fetus is, well, you gave 2 grounds for holding that the prenatal human being is not a person. So let me ask you, one of the grounds was a self-conscious thought, but then another ground you gave was conscious desires. And it seems to me these are 2 distinct grounds. And the reason I say that is that conscious desires, at least according to David Boonin in his famous book, A Defense of Abortion, conscious desires begin between, he argues, 25 weeks in utero and 32 weeks in utero. Whereas self-conscious thought, any self-consciousness and self-awareness only begins in human beings after birth. Most psychologists say that human beings become self-aware at the earliest, around the age of 2. So these are just 2 totally different criteria. It'd be like saying, I think personhood begins at fetal movement, and I think personhood begins at birth. Like those are just totally separate things. So I guess I want to ask you, do you think that personhood begins with conscious desires, or do you think that personhood begins with self-conscious thought?
So I would not separate the 2 in such a sharp way. So I think that if we're talking about the general right to a continued existence, then what a necessary precondition for that is going to be the desire to continue to live. And the self-conscious thought just means that there is going to be a individual in the future that's going to continue to exist that is me. So right. I think one of the questions for personhood is not going to turn on whether something is alive or whether something is a human being. I think it turns on where do I begin?
Okay, so your view then, it seems to me, is more radical, I think, than has been made clear. So the idea, when do human beings begin to have a desire to continue to live? You can only have a desire to continue to live if you are aware that you're alive, right? I mean, if you don't even know you're alive, you can't have a desire to continue to live. So when do human beings become aware that they exist? The psychologists tell us it's around 2 years of age. So are you willing to really defend infanticide up to the age of 2? 2 years
So
after birth, I should clarify.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I would cite more science that says no, it's more the self-conscious desires happen more about 6 to 8 weeks after birth. And I would also say that this view is not as radical as it might sound, because most people would concede that some forms of infanticide are morally permissible. Some cases where children suffer from spina bifida and are only going to live 20 weeks in intense, excruciating pain. Most people would concede that that would be morally permissible if we're trying to increase the amount of happiness in the amount of world to intentionally kill such a child, and that's a form of infanticide.
Right, but your view isn't
But so
limited.
the grounds that we're discussing right now is a right to life, a right to continued existence. And so we're asking, what is a necessary condition of that right to continued existence? Now, there might be other grounds on which it would be unwise or morally impermissible or irrational to intentionally kill a child after it's born on some other grounds. So in engineering, what we call a factor of safety. So if we think that the morally relevant properties happen somewhere around 8 to 10 weeks after birth, well, then we're going to restrict where the line is going to be drawn. So it's well below that. Perhaps there's some point before birth in which we draw the line so that there is a factor of safety built in. Because again, the majority of abortions are done in the first trimester anyways. So what we're talking about in this situation too is, the very, very small extreme examples of when, you would be making the decision to kill a child after its birth within the first week of it. You would know if it had spina bifida and if that decision was going to be.
But the view you're putting forward isn't at all limited to children with spina bifida. And in my view, whether you're a disabled human being or whether you're an able-bodied human being is completely irrelevant for your basic human rights. Disabled human beings have exactly the same basic human rights as every other human being. So I wouldn't want to discriminate against people based on their disability. And your view doesn't limit infanticide.
But you are discriminating them on their species.
Yeah. I think
Okay.
there's been human rights.
So I am discriminating them by using the concepts within what's entailed by personhood, or this concept of a person, whereas you're using this concept of a species, of this human being. And so I don't think there's any normative concepts in your, so when I think you're being a little misleading when you say, well, on my view, all human beings have the same rights. Well, on my view, all persons have the same rights. The question is, what are persons? And that doesn't discriminate on species at all. Perhaps AI, certain forms of AI or aliens have these so-called rights. I think speciesism is a very, very morally relevant concern.
Yeah, so I am not, to go back to the self-consciousness, I think you're medically mistaken. I'm not aware of any psychologist who thinks that self-awareness and self-consciousness arises before around the age of 2. And your view, it seems to me, it isn't that, oh, well, we would have infanticide until 8 weeks and then move it up arbitrarily to a week. If you really hold that the right to live begins with self-awareness, and the scientific literature is correct that self-awareness arises around the age of 2, and I'd be happy to email you citations from the scientific literature that show that, then your view really is that infanticide is permissible up to the age of 2. And you might say, well, this is rare and it doesn't happen. It does happen. In the United States, every single year, there are many cases of infanticide. And if you look outside the United States at China and India, there are thousands and thousands, indeed millions of cases of infanticide. In fact, there's an estimate that in China, there's about 46 million females that are missing. And those are cases mostly of either selective abortion of females or of infanticide of females. So I don't see how, on scientific grounds, you can hold the view that the right to live begins with your desire to continue living, And your desire to continue living can only arise if you know you're alive and you have self-awareness. And you only have self-awareness at 2 years of age, around 2 years of age. About the burning.
Hey,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you want to run?
Yeah. So I think part of the disagreement might be here is there is a distinction between self-consciousness and self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So that I would want to make. So you're saying that, I think what you mean is that self-awareness happens about 2 years of age. Self-consciousness is something different.
Right. But how could you have a desire?
So self-consciousness will be, if we think of ourselves as we put all of the things that are about us in a box, and all of our relations, all of the things about us, but then we take the box away. That continuity that's still there, that's the self-consciousness, meaning so that there are experiences that are unified in such a way that there is a desire to continue living, and this psychologically unified entity that's such that if we were to thwart that desire to continue living, we would be sacrificing something morally relevant. So this concept of self-awareness here is not, or self-consciousness is not the concept of self-awareness that we would be talking about at 2 years of age, where a child literally has the concept of me,
right,
and realizes that I am a me, and
So
that there are other the people that are thems that have that, that might be 2 years of age. But what I'm saying, self-consciousness, is before that. So you were going to say something else before I wanted to make that distinction. So
okay.
Go ahead. I don't want to use up your time.
That's okay. That's okay. So with the so I thought your view was the desire to continue living is what granted the right to life. So let me just say, in concluding this part of our conversation, if I have a desire to maintain the ownership I have of this pen, it seems to me I have to know this pen exists. It doesn't make any sense to say I desire to continue to own this pen if I'm not even aware the pen exists. So until a human being understands that they are an existing subject, which happens around 2, they know that they're different than other subjects, etc., I don't see how they could desire to continue living. But 2 last points. One about the burning building. I think this is I don't think this argument works very well. That there's all kinds of cases where we save one rather than others that don't involve a denial of the right to live of others. So think about a prime minister, a pope, a president. We might save the leader rather than save ordinary citizens. If a bomb goes off, we rush the leader out of the room, even though as a result of rushing the leader out of the room, more people will die. But that doesn't show that those other human beings aren't really people. And then with the violinist argument, really quickly, I thoroughly reject that. I think there are many important differences between the violinist argument and the case of abortion. One is that in the case of abortion, or I think that both biological fathers and mothers have serious obligations to their own minor children. So I have to provide for my own minor children, even though that does involve using my body. So if I were stranded up in a cabin with my infant daughter, I have an obligation to use my body to provide for her, and I have an obligation always to use my body not to harm her. And so the fact that this is not some random violinist, this is this person's daughter or son, gives us a strong reason for thinking that this individual ought to help their own daughter or son. Moreover, in the violinist argument, you're detaching yourself from the violinist. But the reality of abortion is not a gentle detaching from the fetus, but rather is an intentional killing of the human being in utero. It's not like the violinist argument really at all. And so I think that the violinist argument doesn't provide any grounds whatsoever for justifying abortion. And I think many pro-choice people see this as well. I mean, Marianne Warren saw this. There's a huge difference between what you owe to a stranger versus what you owe to your own dependent son or daughter. And in fact, we don't have absolute right to control our bodies. In fact, we have to use our bodies in all sorts of ways to serve the common good. And most of all, to prevent, we can't use our bodies in any way that intentionally harm other individual innocent human beings.
All right, Dr. Kaczor, that's all the time that we have.
All right.
Ben, do you want me to give you the 30 seconds that you'd yielded previously
Oh,
to
no,
now?
that's okay.
All right,
No,
15
that's
minutes
okay.
only.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
All right.
I might not even use all of that.
All right. Ben, the floor is yours.
So we'll just start off where we left off right there. So with the violinist analogy. So I mentioned in my opening statement that the purpose of this thought experiment is not to draw an analogy between violinists and prenatal human beings being aborted. The purpose of the thought experiment is to demonstrate that a right to life does not entail or imply the right to someone else's body. Now, this is something that could be challenged. So famously, Peter Singer is a utilitarian who bucks the tide of this argument and says, no, that you should stay connected to the violinist. You have an obligation to stay connected to the violinist because that would maximize, the amount of well-being in the world. Would you go down a similar route, or do you think that we can morally permissibly disconnect from that violinist, or do you think that we are morally obligated to stay connected to that violinist?
That's a good question, and basically I'm kind of agnostic about it. I don't really have a firm position on whether or not, if the violinist case were real, whether or not we'd have an obligation to be connected up to it. So I guess I don't really have a firm view.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm a philosopher too, so
yeah. When I
definitely got a lot of respect for the agnostic position.
When also I think when the more bizarre the case is, the more difficult it seems to me to get a handle on our intuitions about it, right? So, and I think it's telling that the case for abortion characteristically relies on utterly bizarre analogies. Abortion's like being plugged into a violinist. Abortion is like you have people seeds floating through your window. Abortion is like destroying an alien who's threatening to destroy your body and have all the cells. I mean, you have all these, Thule with the cats that are injected with the growth thing. I mean, the case for abortion has disproportionately relied on these bizarre analogies. Whereas I think the pro-life case relies on very commonsensical, widely held views like it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being.
So just to give some background to listeners, and maybe to eat up a little bit more of my time. So the thought experiments that Dr. Kaczor is referring to, Judith Jarvis Thompson has two additional thought experiments with her famous violinist experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And so the second one involves an expanding child, and you're trapped in a house with an expanding child, and if the child keeps expanding, it will kill you. And so the purpose of it is to establish that a right to life can be overridden by a right to self-defense. So the purpose of these, they might sound like bizarre analogies, but our moral intuitions should hold up in these imagined scenarios. And so that we use these imaginary scenarios to, push our moral intuitions to their limits. I think that's the virtue of things like trolley thought experiments, where you're thinking of, whether to flip a switch to kill one person or several. The second thought experiment is the people seeds experiment, where imagine that seeds can fly in through your window and take hold in your carpet and grow into actual people. And in order to prevent this, you put mesh screen in your window, but occasionally you open your window voluntarily and a people seed comes in and takes root. And so you have a right to rid your home of this people seed. And so this analogy is meant to our intuition that if we're trying to use contraception and that contraception fails, then we can think of a pregnancy almost like an invader, an unwanted invader that's part of the state of nature that we do have a right to remove. And so the idea behind these thought experiments, our question tonight is abortion ever morally permissible? And the purpose of these thought experiments is for us to answer yes, that sometimes they are in the cases of rape, endangerment to the life of the woman, or failed contraception. And that these three thought experiments bring that out. Do I assume you just reject all of those categorically? I don't want to put words in your mouth. But that gives at least some background for us to chew on a little bit now.
Yeah. So I do reject the analogies. I don't think any of them work when you think about them more carefully. Like, for instance, the right to use someone else's body. So the right to life doesn't equal the right to use other people's bodies. So you think, let's say I have a kidney problem. I don't have a right to force you to give me an extra kidney. And I think that's totally correct. But I think the problem for the defender of abortion is that it's abortion that is using someone else's body, not so that you can continue living at all, but so you can live the way you want to live. I mean, in abortion, what happens is that the prenatal human being doesn't donate a kidney. The prenatal human being has all their organs taken out and has their entire body eliminated. So if there's not a right to force someone else to give you a kidney, a fortiori, there's not a right to take all their organs and their very life from them. The right to use your body is severely limited in all kinds of ways. For instance, we don't have a right to walk around naked. We don't have a right to defecate in public. We don't have a right to fornicate in public. We don't have a right to take methamphetamines. We don't have a right to not pay our taxes, because paying our taxes involves using our body to file tax returns and using our body by means of our labor. The government takes however many months of our labor through taxes. And most of all, we don't have a right to use our body in any way that infringes on the bodily integrity of other human beings, right? That's exactly why rape is wrong, because you have one person using their body against another person's body. So the prenatal human being is a different human being that has a different body than the body of his or her mother. So yeah, I definitely don't agree with those kinds of analogies. There was one other point though. I guess that's it. Yeah.
So to come back to, so I framed this, the problem of abortion too, within the much broader problem of just unwanted pregnancies in general.
Yeah.
Like it's a problem that we face as a society. And so that's, we not only have these moral considerations, but then we have the legal considerations or political considerations that go on with it as well. And so I think I can resolve some of our disagreement about the fact that we are both men. So I would concede what you said about, say, well, if you're a man, therefore your argument is, I'd concede all the ad hominem stuff. The reason I laid all of that out in the beginning is to note that there are perspectives to this problem that are just forever beyond our reach. So the existential angst that would be experienced by a woman facing an unwanted pregnancy and the choice of an abortion, that's just something that's just not going to, that just is not something that male human consciousness consists in. It's something that we can understand.
Yeah, I kind of agree, but kind of disagree. So I think you're right. Obviously, men can't get pregnant, at least if we mean by men, I don't want to get the trans.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's pretend we're
talking
all
those quibbles to the side.
Exactly. Pretend we're talking, 5 years ago where only men could get pregnant. I'll just, but so I think that's completely right. But I completely disagree with the idea that men can't feel an existential crisis at an unwanted pregnancy. I think that's 100% false.
I would agree with that.
If a man gets a woman pregnant, it can be like a bomb dropped on his life that unbelievably just shakes him to the very core. I mean, really, talk about an existential crisis. I think it can happen with women, but it can certainly happen with men.
So what I specifically mean is, so the awareness, the angst of having to make the decision yourself, in which then you are going to be judged by all the peers that exist outside of your consciousness. That type of it. Yeah, that's, yeah. And so I think that there might be considerations there that are just forever out of my epistemic limitation. And so by putting that up front, I think we do ourselves a service by heading off any objections of, oh, well, you're just men, and so that you shouldn't be, one, even considering the question of abortion. But then there's an even further objection that goes that we should not be legislating what happens to female bodies either. But again, that takes us, I think, into the political question, which is probably beyond the scope of our discussion here today. But I think we can more or less resolve any of the disagreement we had there. So I think the biggest places where our disagreement would remain is, so I think that the question of abortion is really going to turn on personhood. That's where does a right to continued existence actually begin? And whereas
Can I just,
yeah, absolutely, go ahead.
well, I just want to jump in here because I gave you 6 different arguments.
Yep.
And they all have the same conclusion, that abortion is not a morally permissible choice. None of those 6 arguments mention the word person.
And I think that's too, I think that counts against them.
Yeah, but okay, well, I guess you should say why. So for instance, let's start with the first one. The major premise was all human beings deserve basic human rights.
All persons deserve.
No, that's not my premise.
Rights.
All human beings.
Yeah, I understand, but so that's,
Okay.
you're asking me where I would disagree.
Okay.
So I think that any plausibility that has is because it's using the wrong, it's not using the right moral concept.
Okay, well, let me
And
put
I
this.
think by using science, that's the giveaway.
Well, let me put the point a different way then maybe. Can you give me other cases other than prenatal human beings and newborn human beings, other cases of human beings that aren't persons?
Yes, so someone who's in a persistent vegetative state
Okay.
would no longer be a person.
So it'd be fine. So if let's say Jennifer Aniston goes into a persistent vegetative state and a hospital janitor goes into her room when no one's around, locks the door, has sexual intercourse with her and leaves, has that janitor done something wrong?
Yes, but not for consequentialist reasons. They would have done something wrong for contractualist or Kantian reasons.
But you said this person's no longer a person, so you don't have a person there anymore on your view. So it couldn't be wrong for violating the personal rights of her.
Yes, but we also, corpses have a standing in society in that we do have obligations to to a corpse. So I would think that in a contractualist sense, we do have obligations to a corpse. We owe something to other people's corpses.
Okay, well, she's not a corpse at that point, I would say, but.
Well, she is a corpse. And so she's not a person, she's dead. It's not a regular death, but it's basically death.
Yeah.
She's not a person and she's not going to come out
So
of
it's
the
wrong to.
situation.
So it's wrong to have sexual intercourse with an unconscious woman if the unconsciousness is lasting, on your view, because that means. So why again? So I get the legal idea that legally in the United States, why morally?
So why morally? So first off is when we're talking about her consciousness and her persistent vegetative state, we're talking about what's going to happen to her.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking in consequentialist terms. We're no longer talking in deontological or contractualist terms. We're not talking in terms of what we owe to each other. We're talking in terms about what we could rationally will. So I think in order to get to the right answer in this particular case, we have to climb the moral mountain from a different side. Not the consequentialist side, we have to climb it from the contractualist or the deontological side. And so I think that in the situation that you bring up, we owe things to other person's corpses. And so we can get into, so why is that the case? We could use something like a concept of John Rawls' veil of ignorance. And so in which we don't know which lot we're going to have in society. Would we want to be the corpse that gets defiled behind everyone's back within the society? No, that's something that we could reasonably object to. We could have reasons to be objected to be treated in that way. Okay. So on contractualist terms,
Okay, so
on contractualist grounds, we can say that this is wrong.
so if we use Rawls's veil of ignorance, and you could be the quote unquote unwanted child that's getting killed in abortion.
Well, so there is no you. So remember I said that the question, the important question was, when do I begin? But when we're talking about the abortion of a prenatal human being, there is no I. So when you say,
but there's no
what
I,
if you were the prenatal human being? I was never the prenatal human being.
Right, but there's no I in the corpse either.
Not anymore, but we did have obligation. There was psychological connectedness before. So we could have past obligations to people from things that we owe to people in the past. So this is why we treat the corpses in Tulsa right now, the Tulsa massacre, that we're currently digging up. Yeah, they're corpses, but we're treating them in a certain way. Why are we treating them in that way? I think the right answer for that becomes on contractualist grounds.
Real quick, I'll just let you know that I'll start the 20 minutes now for free dialogue. So go at it, and I will step back.
Oh, yeah.
20 minutes,
Yeah,
what you want to do.
Keep rolling.
I feel like we kind of got into that already a little bit.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
The one thing I want to ask you is, okay, so I guess partly I object to your idea of who I am. So you say, well, I only arise, later. And I think that's false. So for instance, it clearly is the case that you can do something, you could have done something to me prenatally that would have harmed me, like giving me fetal alcohol syndrome, right? That would have harmed me. Or there are cases of botched abortions where people, where there's human beings who are, there's an attempted abortion and the human beings get injured, and then the human beings are injured afterwards. And they say, well, how'd this happen? Well, I got injured prenatally. Or my mother, when I was in utero, drank too much. So now I have fetal alcohol syndrome. So the idea that I only begin to exist when my conscious desires come into existence, it seems to me is completely false. Again, then I'd have to say bizarre things like, on your view, it sounds like, I couldn't say I was born. That wasn't me. That was just a predecessor organism that I'm inhabiting. I don't think that I inhabit my body. I think that's a false way of thinking about what a human being is. Human beings don't inhabit bodies. Human beings are living bodies. I don't inhabit my body, and the real me isn't my thoughts and beliefs and all that. The real me is this living organism. I am a human being, right? I'm not my thoughts or desires. And part of the reason we can know this is think about cases of multiple personality disorder. So you can have one human organism who has 3 or 4 or 7 or 24 sets of alters, right? Where they have different memories, beliefs, desires, conceptions of themselves, etc. But I don't think it's reasonable at all to say, well, that's, this thing here, this is really 24 different persons. Because we've got 24 sets of desires, beliefs, memories, etc. No, and in fact, if a psychologist or a psychiatrist cures me of multiple personality disorder so that all those alternate personalities go away, the proper way of characterizing that action is not, oh, the psychologist destroyed 23 persons. Well, no, there's just one person here. There's just one individual human being here. I had a psychological disorder, so I had all these other personalities. So I think the way you're characterizing a person is totally contrary to common sense. Almost everyone thinks they were born, right? And when the mom puts pictures of the pregnancy on the refrigerator, they say, well, that was you. Here's you at 8 weeks, right? That's what they say. And I think your view of what a human being is just I am my thoughts. I think that's false too.
Okay, so this is super exciting. I love that. This is great. So this takes us into the philosophical deep waters of personhood. What is a person? And so this is a question that's fascinated me quite a bit. And so I'm really excited to kind of get into this because the first thing that I want to say is that, first off, I concede that it's a human being. So at all these times, conceded that it's a human being. The question is when we're going through time, what is the fact that makes us the same person through time? If there's going to be some future experience, what makes it the case that that future experience will be my future experience? And so there's four broad views to answer this question. And the first is that I'm my body. The second is that I'm my brain. The third is that I'm a soul. And the fourth is that I'm memories and some bundle of psychological connectedness. And so I've defended that last view, the bundle of psychologically connectedness view. Whereas it seems like with your human being view, we would have to insist that personhood is constituted by a brain or a body or a soul, or some combination of the two. And I think we can pretty definitively show that that can't be the case. And so, yes, my view might go against common sense, but only in the sense that the traditional Buddhist sense of personhood goes against common sense, in that the simplicity of the concept of I is just something that we read into the world. And so, to use the first thought experiment, imagine that you step into a teletransporter machine, and the teletransporter machine takes a full scan of your body, of every molecule, everywhere it's at, and it beams it at the speed of light to Mars, where an organic replicator makes a perfect copy of you. So what happened? When the machine destroys your body here on Earth, did you travel at the speed of light? Who wakes up on Mars? Well, the correct answer is that the teletransporter killed you, and that who wakes up on Mars is a new person who's psychologically just like you. And we can see this if we just imagine your body not being destroyed on Earth. And so your body was scanned on Earth, it was replicated on Mars, and now there's two yous. That really strains the notion of a person there. If we were to take our brains and cut them in half and put them in two different bodies, then they were psychologically just like you. They're not one and the same person. Two different people would wake up from such a procedure. They could go on and live different lives. You know, one could go do philosophy and one could go be a banker, and they could get back together, you know, later on and say, remember when we were one and the same person? We're not one and the same person right now. And what this shows is that personhood is constituted by psychological connectedness and memory and those self-conscious thoughts that I mentioned earlier. And everything that matters is contained within there. So I would press when you say that my concept of personhood strains credulity, I think my concept of personhood is the one that's going to be the most robust here. It's going to be the one that actually contains everything.
So let me get this straight. We got two different views of personhood. One view, oh yeah, right. But I'm contrasting my view, the bodily one, with your view. So yes. Limit to that. So here's the two views. On one view, you can say things like, I was born, I was in my mother's womb, my mother nursed me when I was a baby. On the other view, you have to give all that up and say, well, if I'm teleported to Mars and I'm duplicated and half my brain's cut in half and put in someone else's body, well, then there would be two persons. And intuitively speaking, that view's stronger than my view? That seems hard to believe.
Well, I mean, when you caricature it that way, so what I'm saying is that my view of personhood is more robust. And so that when you say, I was in my mother's womb, you're just taking the simplicity of the concept I, and you're just reading it into the world. And that's a mistake. And that we can show that that's a mistake by using these thought experiments.
Yeah, I don't quite think that's right. I mean,
so then what makes it the case that we are the same person through time? What makes it the case that some future experience will be mine? Am I my body, my brain, or my soul?
I would say that you are your body. So you are a human being, and human beings are mammals, and that's what you are. And so if the contents of your mind were somehow transported somewhere else, that wouldn't be you. That would be the contents of your mind, which are different than you. So we obviously can have situations where the contents of our mind are radically shifted. And almost no one says, oh, that's a totally different person now, right? Say people who get injured and have a serious brain injury, and all of a sudden their personality changes a lot. No one says, oh, this is, this human being, died and was replaced with someone else. We say it's the same human being. This human being was injured. And then as a result,
well, we would say it's a different person. We might say that they're altered in such a way that they're no longer the same person.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I think the more proper way of saying it would be,
I think this is where using human being is misleading. Because if we're using person, all of a sudden these claims don't carry the plausibility that they did when you were using the word human being.
but think about the criminal justice system. When we don't say, oh, you murdered multiple people, and now, since your personality has changed, well, we'll just let you off because it was a totally different person who did those murders.
Well, sure we do. We do recognize that there are people with mental impairedness, and that these affect the way people are, people with split personalities. That's something that we would take into effect, that we take into account when we were passing some sort of sentence on them, because we would realize that their volition is in some way because ought implies can, and if you can't act in certain ways, then you couldn't possibly be held accountable for those acts.
Yeah, let me ask you though about my objection for multiple personality syndrome. So let's say I have, 10 different personalities, 10 different tracks of beliefs, memories, etc. So 10 different, is your view that there's one mammal here sitting in this chair, and in I guess there's one mammal, there's actually 10 different persons?
Well, yeah, that are all psychologically connected. So we could call them personites. That might be less misleading. And so when we characterize them that way, it obviously loses any weird sound.
But the view you're putting forward is correct, that it's different persons. So then if the psychiatrist cures me.
Different personalities, sure.
But no, what you said, if I understood you right, was to be a person means you have a unity of self-conscious thought over time. But in my case, there's 10 of those. So if
there's behaviors. There's different behaviors at different times.
No, if you have multiple personality disorder, you have up to whatever number of different unity of self-conscious thought over time. There's 10 different ones. There's Jacques, and there's Francis, and there's whoever. So if that was right, then you'd have to say that the psychiatrist who cures me, who gets rid of the 9 others, and now I'm just back to being Christopher Kaczor.
Can we do that? Is that even a thing? Like you can just get rid of the 9 others and cure?
Well, I don't know if we can. I don't know if we actually can.
I don't think that the site you have the psychological facts right here. So I think of these as chainmail through time. And so that someone with multiple personalities is going to have chainmail that goes off in all kinds of weird different directions. And over time, certain bits are going to be falling off and other bits are going to be good. Whereas other people's personality is more continuous and smooth. It doesn't have those spats where you become someone else. So yeah. I think that you might not have the right concept of what multiple personalities would ascribe as far as personhood, because you'd still have one single unified consciousness.
No, I don't
have different personalities. Why not?
I think that's correct. No, because these different personalities literally don't remember and have no conscious.
But they have psychological connectedness.
No, they don't.
They're not. How? How do they?
Well, because they have different beliefs, they have different memories, they have different desires. All the things that you think constitute a person are what's different about the different personalities. But let me go back, because I mean we're getting off into relatively deep philosophical waters. I'd like to get it back to the focus.
Yeah.
And I'd like to respond to 2 things you said earlier, which I didn't have a chance to respond to.
Sure.
The first is rape. And I think that a woman who's raped, obviously this is a traumatic, horrible, catastrophically bad action that the rapist did. And I think it can be obviously absolutely traumatic and horrible for the terrible, it's such a terrible act for the person who undergoes it. I think all that's right. But a woman who gives life in a situation like that is acting on principles that are exact opposite of what the rapist did. So nothing in the world can go back in time and undo a rape. But a woman who gives life in this situation does exactly the opposite. Rather than using violence against an innocent person, she chooses to be nonviolent towards an innocent person. Rather than having the powerful dominate the less powerful, she chooses to allow the less powerful to flourish. Rather than take away someone else's freedom, a woman who gives life in that situation gives someone freedom. So nothing can undo a rape. But the fact is that if you or I or any of us were conceived by rape or incest or whatever, we have exactly the same basic human rights as every single other human being. And so our basic human rights don't change as the result of the circumstances of our conception. The second thing I wanted to, well, if we have time, there's the second thing I want to say, but if you want to respond to that first, then I can let you, we can do that. But there's a second thing I want to say too.
So I would just say, so I think that the categorical pro-life view has to come to terms with the idea of a rape victim having to carry a child to term and raise it subsequently. And that seems horrible to our mental or to our moral intuitions. But I would warn everyone listening, though, that this is moral philosophy. So on the other side, the categorical pro-choice view that I defend, I have to come to terms with the possibility of infanticide. And that seems morally just horrible. And so these are the implications of those views. And so you just have to come to terms with it. So, I mean, I could press Dr. Kaczor, I think, on, like, how could you possibly make a woman, expect a woman to raise, a rapist's child. But if that's the case, that, a categorical pro-life position is right, that's the implication of it. And so it's a matter of coming to terms with how do we understand the morality of it. And I think that's one of the things that makes this question just so difficult to get at, because it seems, both sides have plausible arguments on their side, but they also both have just implausible seeming implications that it's just hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I see. I guess I don't.
So I wasn't pushing back too much. I was trying to.
Okay, no, that's fair. But I would say this, that evil people can put other people, innocent, good people, in situations where they only have two choices: either the morally heroic or the morally wrong. So that's what evil people often do, right? Think of many things that Hitler did. He would take people and basically put them in a situation where either they have to do something absolutely heroic, give up their life, endure torture, or they have to do something morally reprehensible, turn in their innocent, companions and destroy their lives. So, I would say that bad people can do that to us, right? I mean, a bad person could hold a gun to your head and say, look, you have to, murder this 3-year-old child, or I'm going to kill you. Well, if a bad person does that, I'll have to, two choices are horrible. I either have to suffer death from this terrible guy, or I have to do something that's horrible. So in my view, as you know, abortion is very seriously wrong. And so the abortion or cases of rape are especially horrible, because I think that the victim of the rape is put by this bad person in a terrible situation of either heroism, and it is heroism, no two ways about it. And frankly, lots of other cases are heroism, a pregnancy or heroism too. But they either have to be heroic or do something that I think is seriously wrong. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I didn't have a chance to, is about the life of the mother. So the view I defend is this, that if the mother's life is endangered, it is permissible to her to take any medical means necessary she needs to save her life, outside of intentionally killing the child, aside from. So for instance, let's say a pregnant woman gets cancer and she has cancer of the uterus. On my view, it is morally permissible to remove the cancer, remove the uterus, even if as a side effect, the prenatal human being ends up dying as a side effect of that. And I'm unaware of any case in which intentional killing of a child as a means or as an end, or of the prenatal human being, I should have said, as a means or as an end, is needed to save the life of the mother. In almost all cases, the woman can get legitimate medical treatment that she would get even if she weren't pregnant. And again, on my view, if that, as an unfortunate side effect, ends up causing the death or miscarriage of a prenatal human being, I think that is morally acceptable.
Ben, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. How much time do we have left?
A minute and just a minute.
I'll go ahead. Yeah, we'll go ahead. Yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there then.
All right, you'll
'Cause
yield?
Next is question answer. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. All right. So then online, I had a few questions come in. This is ahead of time when I asked this to the online community. So most of the questions are for Dr. Kaczor. So I'll just start off with the one question that I thought was interesting for Ben. So I'm not going to say the full name for confidentiality, but Ted on Facebook writes, if Ben believes there is a time during pregnancy when abortion is no longer morally permissible, how is that point chosen? If not, is it morally permissible to kill recently born children? Finally, could the logic of drawing a line at a point in which abortion becomes wrong be applied similarly to the lives of other humans, like the mentally handicapped or elderly? That's a question from Ted. That was for you, Ben.
That's for me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think I understand the question.
So the question is basically, first, like if you draw the line on what constitutes a person, then would this make it permissible to kill recently born children? And could it possibly make it permissible to kill mentally handicapped or elderly individuals in certain conditions?
So the last question sounds like euthanasia. And so I am a proponent of euthanasia in the sense that I think there is dying with dignity. The first question, though, I think we need to realize that person is a vague predicate. So what do I mean by that? The predicate of being a pile or being a heap is a vague predicate. This is often called the paradox of the heap or the paradox of the pile. Basically, it asks, how many grains of sand does it take before something is a pile? Is it 1 grain of sand? Is it 2 grains of sand? What is a pile and a non-pile? We pretty obviously know what is a pile and what isn't a pile. But so whatever the answer is, it's going to be imprecise, and it's going to have certain degree of arbitrariness to it. And so I think the same thing happens with personhood. We have to ask, as this zygote, this prenatal human being is developing, at what point does it become a person? And there's certain points where we can be more confident that it is a person with a right to continued existence, and places where we can be less confident. And so I mentioned earlier that in engineering we have what's called a factor of safety, where we demarcate these lines to make them the least arbitrary because of vagueness, is to set limits well below where we are already confident. That way we're well below any limit. If we cut off all abortions after the first trimester, so to speak, if that's our factor of safety, what we're saying is that, look, we're confident that we can morally permissibly abort these fetuses without any significant moral objection to it. Whereas the further we get from that point, the more morally gray it gets. And if we're going to eat up that factor of safety, it has to be for some good reason. Whereas I mentioned earlier, most people will concede that a child born with spina bifida that's only going to live a few days of excruciating pain, that it would be morally permissible to end the life of such an infant. And that is a form of infanticide.
So to continue then,
but we would
sorry.
need, sorry. So we would need that weighty reason, like having spina bifida, for us to want to start eating up that safety factor that we built in when we drew those lines, to try to get even though our answers are going to be imprecise, we can still use that concept of a factor of safety to stay within morally permissible limits.
Yeah, just to, give Ted his due. The second part of his question was, basically, would it be morally permissible to kill recently born children? And I guess I can add this, my own kind of piece to it. I mean, would you say that based on the principle of personhood that you're proposing, it is at least in principle permissible to possibly, if a woman chooses to kill a recently born child.
Yes. Yes, and that's how the categorical pro-choice view has to come to terms with infanticide. Just like the categorical pro-life view has to come to terms with rape and the life of a mother and situations like that. This is where do we draw the line? Where do we say that it's a pile, it's a person, that it's something with moral properties that demand our attention?
All right, now to Dr. Kaczor, and then if we have time afterwards too, we can pick up on some of the things that have been said. I'm trying to stay objective. I want to ask my own questions, but I need to, be hands off.
Sure.
So Dr. Kaczor, Ben online asked the question, when abortion was illegal prior to Roe, what was the net loss of human females who died from an illegal abortion compared to the net loss of females from legal abortion?
So prior to the legalization of abortion in the United States, the number of women who died from illegal abortions was declining very radically. So in an attempt to justify legalized abortion, the National Abortion Rights Action League fabricated statistics about how many women had died from illegal abortion. So one of the founders of the National Abortion Rights Action League, named Bernard Nathanson, admitted afterwards that they just made up numbers, and then the press uncritically transmitted these numbers. So the exact numbers basically were going down in the period prior to Roe. And in fact, the year before Roe versus Wade was legalized, I want to say the number of women who died from illegal abortions in the United States was something like 73 or something like that. Why did the numbers come down? Well, partly because of better use of things like antibiotics that enabled many women who had illegal abortions to end up not getting infections that led to their death. I am not in favor of illegal abortions. I'm against all abortions, legal or illegal. And I think all abortions, legal or illegal, carry a risk for the mother to die, for the mother to lose her ability to reproduce, for the mother to have very serious psychological trauma afterwards. So I'm not I'm against both illegal abortion and also against legal abortion. But I think, our debate wasn't supposed to be about the legality of the, it wasn't supposed to be, it's more about the morality. I do think these two things are connected though, because at least on my view, one of the fundamental purposes of government is to secure the equal basic rights of all human beings. And so I think allowing abortion or allowing infanticide is not protecting the basic human rights of all human beings, or for that matter, to allow the rape or the killing of human beings that are cognitively impaired, that are in a so-called persistent vegetative state. I think that also would be problematic, because I think the basic purpose of government is to protect the basic human rights, especially the right to live, of all human beings.
All right, and then Seth has this question. So he asked the question, how common is a medical situation requiring an abortion to save the mother's life?
So I think we have to distinguish between two different things. So I talked before about cases of medical interventions to save the mother's life. Now, these are fairly rare, but there are cases, and I already talked about one, where a woman, say, gets cancer of the uterus. And my view is that what abortion properly understood is, I would define it as the intentional killing of a prenatal human being. So if you're doing some medical treatment, and as an unfortunate side effect of that medical treatment, the human being in utero ends up dying, I would say that that's very sad, it's tragic, it's unfortunate, but that's not morally wrong. That a woman who has cancer, for example, can get chemotherapy, can have her uterus removed, can do whatever she would do if she weren't pregnant in order to save her life. Now, she doesn't have to do that. There are sometimes where women get pregnant and say they have cancer, and they say, look, I already have brain cancer, I've got breast cancer, yes, I have uterine cancer too, but I'm not going to, as an unfortunate side effect, have this human being die. I'm going to bring the pregnancy to term. And then I recognize that as a result of my choice of bringing the pregnancy to term, I am not going to live. And I think that that's her decision. If she wants to try to preserve her life, that's fine. She's not doing abortion, that is intentional killing of the unborn. If she wants to save the life of her son or daughter, I think that's perfectly fine too. And I would say that's not suicide. In other words, suicide, I would say, is intentionally ending your own life. So the woman who forgoes medical treatment because she foresees that this would end up killing her unborn son or daughter, I would say, is doing something that is heroic. She doesn't have to do that. But if she chooses to do that, I would say that is morally permissible. So there's no case of which I'm aware that the doctor has to intentionally end the life of the human being in utero, either as a means or as an end, as the only way to save the life of the mother.
All right, and then to give you one other question that came online, Dr. Kaczor. So this is the last question, and then I guess I'll ask Ben one question and Dr. Kaczor one question from myself, to fill in the time a little bit. Okay, so Daniel online asks, there are cases of twins in utero where the parents have to choose between ending one life to save the other or run a high risk losing both. While this is a heartbreaking scenario, he says this, to tell those parents that they can't choose to save one of their children is ethically nonsensical. What would you say in response?
Yeah, so these are cases I've actually dealt with. So I work as an ethics consultant for a hospital. And so you do get cases, and it's called twin-twin transfusion syndrome, where basically one twin is really sick, and then the sick one can die, and then basically after they die, it ends up killing the other twin. And so these cases are similar to the cases that I talked about, and they're governed by something called double effect reasoning. And the basic idea is that it is permissible to do an action to save someone's life, even if, as an unfortunate side effect, it ends up taking someone else's life. So in the cases you're talking about, they do exist, and I've actually dealt with maybe 20 of these cases. Basically what the doctor can do is prevent the dying infant, the dying unborn child, from transmitting, as it were, the pathogens and stuff to the living healthy twin. And as a result of these sorts of interventions, what happens is the twin that's dying, dies, and the other twin survives. So basically there's a whole art of prenatal maternal fetal medicine that deals with these sorts of cases of twin-twin transfusion syndrome. And basically what the medical interventions do is clamp off the umbilical cord from the dying twin so as to prevent the pathogens and stuff from going through the umbilical cord of the dying twin into the placenta, harming the living twin. And it's very unfortunate when that happens, but that is not, in my view, intentional killing. That is best described, in my view, as preventing the healthy twin from dying by a means which, as an unfortunate side effect, ends up killing the other twin. And part of the reason I think this, you can see how this is permissible, is to think about it this way. If you had a poison gas that was going off and it's going to kill two people, is it permissible to leave the room and shut the door, right? Leaving the person with the poison gas to die? I would say yes. I would say that's different than killing the other guy to somehow survive. In other words, in a situation where there are two people's lives are at stake, it is permissible to secure your own life, not by killing the other person intentionally, but rather by allowing the other person to die as an unfortunate side effect of your legitimate action. So if we think about the twin-twin transfusion syndrome, imagine that one of the twins, the sick twin, dies. Could, after the death of the sick twin, could the doctor go in and clamp the umbilical cord and stop the transfusion of the bad stuff from the dead twin to the healthy twin? I would say definitely they could. The whole point of that, shutting off the umbilical cord, isn't to kill the sick twin, but solely to prevent the pathogen from killing the healthy twin. So those are sad and unfortunate cases, but I don't think those undermine the idea that I've been talking about. That is that all human beings, both those waiting to be born and those that are born, deserve basic human rights.
All right, now just to ask one question to Ben, then one question to Dr. Kaczor, and don't worry, I'm not going to give Dr. Kaczor a softball and Ben a hard question. I'm going to be as fair as I can to both of them. So Ben, just ask you my question, right? One that was kind of burning in my head. So imagine, for instance, so we focused a lot on this conversation on personhood, and that was kind of like the central focus of your case. in a way. There were other arguments included, including autonomy, and you had something like desert and retribution, or desert and so forth. But to get to the core on personhood, so imagine like we have this bucket, all right, and this bucket is a person, and then you have two organisms, right? And Dr. Kaczor is going to say, by virtue of this organism being human, it goes in the personhood bucket. So then personhood becomes like an individual moral subject, let's say, a subject of individual moral value. And you would say that it needs, let's say, some kind of set of properties that are psychologically unified, self-aware, and so forth to count and get into this bucket. So the question that I wanted to ask you is that you mentioned before how this is going to be an imprecise project. But if you think about Dr. Kaczor's position, right, just saying that the organism that is a person, an individual subject of moral value, by virtue that happens by virtue of being human. That's a really straightforward, simple, I would say, principled account on what a person is. You know, even if you don't like the ramifications that follow, it at least has a simple starting point. Whereas with your position, it seems as if simultaneously you're trying to get the moral outcome that you want and construct the conception of personhood that you admit is arbitrary to some extent to get the outcome you want. Does that make sense? So it seems as if there's something maybe, I don't know, question begging going on here, right? Because I would say that Dr. Kaczor has maybe that theoretical virtue, simplicity, and principle of being principled. Does that make sense?
So there's an analogous, yeah, I think so. So there's an analogous sense in which Dr. Kaczor is going to have to deal with the same problem of vague predicates. So in biology, life is a vague predicate. So it's a difficult scientific question to understand what is something living, but we can obviously distinguish between something dead and something alive. So again, it's the in-between. How do we characterize something as something living and as something as dead? Whereas in moral philosophy, we have the same problem with personhood. So while I concede the scientific fact that something that it's human being and that it's alive, the fact that it is human being, I don't think is what makes it morally relevant. So my concept of personhood is much broader than the concept of human being. So in my view, all human beings are not just persons by the virtue of their being human. They're persons by virtue of other things about them. Their self-consciousness, their psychological continuity, their capacity for pain. These are the things that I think constitute personhood, and that these are things that are not going to be settled by a scientific experiment, even though I do think that scientific experiments can obviously help inform how we understand personhood. So am I trying to get a conclusion out of this? Probably not, because what brings me to this topic even at all is because of my interest in Derek Parfit and the bigger question of personhood in general, about what makes something the same thing through time. And so that's the big question that I've wrestled with there. And I think that the concept of personhood that has been worked out from all of that work in philosophy of mind has implications to applied ethics that are very, very important here. Because once we understand what kind of thing a person is, and then we can understand what rights certain things have and other things don't, and we can craft policy based on that so that we can maximize happiness by giving women the right amount of bodily control over the autonomy over their bodies, while also solving the problem of unwanted pregnancy that doesn't sacrifice something morally relevant.
Yeah, well,
so we have the problem of unwanted pregnancy, and we want to solve it morally permissibly.
Yeah, so basically, the way that I was conceiving the question, and Ben, you did a fine job answering it. It was just, like when we enter this debate on personhood, we kind of, I guess like it's really hard to have a quote unquote valueless assessment of what a person is. So what I was saying is it seems as if at the same time you were defining a person, you already had your values in mind so that you were like, doing this project simultaneously. But I'm sure someone could switch the argument and say, well, Dr. Kaczor, because he's a Roman Catholic perhaps, or he's a man, blah, 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 he's also doing this same thing when it comes to personhood. You can't have a valueless assessment. Does that make sense? It's like when you define what a person is, it seems as if in the
Well,
background
and I
you already
admit
have the
that.
conclusion you want to
So
get. Yeah.
the substantive moral assumption that I appealed to is that it's wrong. Intentionally killing a person is a wrong-making property of an act. So that's where we can both agree to that. We both agree that persons have the property of having a right to continued existence, a property that we should respect. And so the question is, how do we understand this property? And I don't think we can understand that property through scientific methods alone. I think it's going to require philosophical methods, and it's going to be a matter of moral philosophy. And so then we can compare the concepts of personhood. These are hypotheses that we can then compare for theoretical virtues. And so that's why I gave the teletransporter example and then the splitting of the brain example. These aren't to make the view unnecessarily complicated. They're the tools that we use to understand the concept of personhood that's relevant here, because it's the concept of personhood that's going to help us answer the question both what makes us the same thing through time, and then using those, what we get from that, we can then say, okay, how does this help us understand the applied ethics of abortion? And so I'm really just building this applied ethics, my case, on top of existing material that's already there of personhood, and then the Judith Thompson thought experiments of how even if a prenatal human being has a right to life, it doesn't have a serious right to life that would outweigh a mother's bodily autonomy. And those three thought experiments, the People Seeds, Expanded Child, Violinist, are all meant to show that even if we concede that prenatal human beings are persons, it still doesn't follow that all abortions are morally impermissible.
All right, and then to go to Dr. Kaczor, I remember in the first edition of your book, The Ethics of Abortion, there's a passage where you talk about the difficult cases. And there's one that I think you and John Finnis mentioned, which is when the birth canal of the woman is too small, and as the child's head is coming out, it gets stuck in the birth canal. And I believe sometimes the doctor has to crush the head of the child in order to save the mother's life. I was wondering, could you comment on how your principle or conception of personhood would be applied to those cases?
Yeah, so my view is that all human beings have basic human rights. And so I don't really like the term personhood, because I think it is, as our whole conversation has shown, very arbitrary. And I think that's a problem, right? I mean, you can talk about personhood as a unity of self-conscious thought, but it's unclear to me still why we should choose that understanding of personhood. When Locke was the first philosopher that I'm aware of who put forward something like that understanding of a person, the unity of thought over time in different places, et cetera, et cetera. But Locke's conception of personhood wasn't about who has basic human rights, who would it be wrong to kill. It was rather about moral responsibility. So, I mean, if we really took Locke's view seriously, we'd say, as Ben did earlier, that in a different video online, where he talked about the ability to consent. And the discussion was about when is sexual intercourse permissible. And in an online video, he said, well, clearly at 3 years old, you don't have the ability to consent to sexual intercourse. In other words, you can't really take moral responsibility when you're 3. But if we really adopted Locke's understanding of a person, you wouldn't be a person at 3 or 4, maybe at 8. I mean, it would be completely outside of even the most radical advocate of infanticide. But to get to your point, my view is, as should be clear by now, all human beings deserve basic respect. All human beings deserve protection. And so the human being at the end of birth, about to be born, deserves respect and protection. Now, the right to life is, I think, properly understood as the right not to be intentionally killed. It's not a right, the right to life isn't about someone doing some legitimate action that, as an unfortunate side effect, ends up killing you. So like the mother who has cancer, whose uterus is removed, is not, on my view, violating the right to life of the human being in utero. So when you get to craniotomy, the question would be, craniotomy would be when there's a cephalopelvic disproportion. It's basically the head of the baby is too large to exit the birth canal. So basically, there's two different views about that. One view says that the doctor, in reducing the scope of the child's skull, that just is intentionally killing. If you have that view, then you would say that craniotomy is morally impermissible. The view that John Finnis has, Robert George has, and the view that I am not 100% certain I have, but I lean towards, is what you might call a more narrow view of intention. And that would mean that you are not intending someone's death unless you're aiming at making that person dead. So even doing something like reducing the circumference of a skull would not, on that view, actually be intentional killing, even though obviously you foresee that as an unfortunate side effect of this, the child will die. So it would be something like this. If, say you had a shotgun and you were about to shoot my daughter, and I jumped in front of the shotgun as you shot, well, I would obviously completely know I'm going to die as a result of this. But the goal of my doing that is not to make myself dead. The goal solely and simply is to prevent the shotgun shots from hitting my daughter. So, you know, as an unfortunate side effect of me getting in the way, it ends up causing my death. And I know that it'll cause my death with 100% certainty. So I think you could make a case, and I think I agree with this, that in the case of craniotomy, the physician does know as an unfortunate side effect it'll cause the death of the baby about to be born, but in fact is not intending death, but rather is accepting death as an unfortunate side effect of reducing the cranial size in order to allow the labor to be completed.
Yeah, thank you. For the sake of time, do you guys want me to keep the 7-minute closing statements, or could we reduce it down to 5? Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's
Fine with
fine
me.
with me.
All
I
right.
don't have anything written.
All right, Dr. Kaczor, I'll let you have your 5 minutes for closing remarks.
Okay. So on my view, it is a huge mistake to invoke the idea of a person. And part of the reason I think it's a huge mistake is that this very term has been used historically in ways to exclude vulnerable populations. There was a notorious case of the Supreme Court, decided 7-2. And in the Supreme Court case, this was around the time of Abraham Lincoln, it was called the Dred Scott case. And the Supreme Court in this decision said that to be an African American, you do not count as a person. And so basically it caused, slavery to continue to exist. Now, why were they able to get away with this? Well, the term person, if you mean by person, you can define it any way you want. You could just say, well, persons are those that have self-conscious thought, or persons in the Lockean sense are those who can take responsibility for their actions. It is a term that can be defined in, and has been defined in, unbelievably different sorts of ways. But just like defining persons in Dred Scott was arbitrary, I think defining persons now is arbitrary. And we can't found a just society based on arbitrary decisions about who does count and who doesn't count. So if you think of the exclusion of African Americans from personhood, well, it's important to say, okay, well, why is that? Well, what makes someone an African American? Well, if you have a grandfather who's Black, is that enough? What if it's just a great-great-grandfather? Is it just having one drop of Black blood and then you're quote unquote excluded from personhood? So you can see how this is a completely arbitrary concept. But I think we get the same arbitrariness here. Are you a person when you have conscious desires? Well, that's one view. That's the view of David Boonin, who says that starts not after birth, but before birth, 25 weeks. On the other hand, Ben seems to be advocating a different view, which is not conscious desires, but self-conscious thought and the desire to continue to exist. Well, you can't desire to continue to exist unless you know you exist. And the psychologists tell us no human being knows that they exist until about the age of 2. Well, I personally think that it would be catastrophically wrong to kill a 1-year-old because they're not quote unquote a person. So my view is that we should learn from history. Every single time we have ever divided the human family into two groups, those human beings that have basic human rights and deserve respect, and those human beings that don't have human rights and don't deserve human respect, we've made a catastrophic mistake. This was true when the powerful whites excluded people of color. It was true when the powerful Europeans excluded native peoples. It was true when people had power in religion and excluded people that were of a different religion. And I think it's true now, where people that are born and healthy and strong want to argue and exclude those who are weak, vulnerable, and unborn from basic human protection. So I think we should learn from history, and we should be inclusive. When I asked Ben about what other cases of human beings wouldn't count as persons, aside from immature human beings like newborns, he said, well, a human being in a persistent vegetative state. But I think that too is problematic. According to the law, people in persistent vegetative states are still persons. According to the law, it would be rape to go in and rape some unconscious woman, and it would be murder to murder an unconscious woman, even permanently unconscious. So my view is that we should learn from history. And I want to, I guess, conclude by saying that we're not talking about just arbitrary philosophical concepts. This issue is something that affects real people. So there was a woman who was had an unplanned pregnancy in California, and it was a traumatic time for her, and family conflicts, and she was still a student, and she decided to resolve this crisis pregnancy. So she went to Spokane, Washington, and up in Spokane, at the time abortion was legal in California, but she went up to Spokane. She went into a home for unwed mothers, and 9 months later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And that boy was placed in a family for adoption. And that baby boy was me. So when we're talking about abortion, we're not talking about some theoretical construct. We're not talking about persons and do they have a right to live. We're talking about actual flesh and blood, real human beings like me and like many others. And right now in the United States, there's about 36 couples for every baby who's available to be adopted. So I certainly sympathize with people like my mother who went through an unplanned pregnancy, but my mother would be the first to tell you that she made the right decision and that my life had value, even though I was unwanted. And so that's one of the reasons that I think abortion is such an important issue, because it does affect real human lives like my own.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kaczor. All right, Ben, the last 5 minutes to you.
Okay, so I want to close by first saying that we are not doing law and we are not doing science. We are doing moral philosophy. And so this was the point that I really wanted to stress with the is-ought gap. And so why am I saying this? It's because we can't do away with the concept of a person. So human being is a biological descriptor, but we're not doing science, we're doing moral philosophy. We need the concept of a person. We need this moral concept in order to, and so we can ask what makes us persons and compare our answers. They're explanatory hypotheses or theories. And in light of their implications and explanatory power, some conceptions of personhood are going to be better than others. And so to come back to this idea that people have misused the concept of personhood in the past, I'm not going to deny that, but they were also misusing it by using methods like science. They were appealing to non-normative features of people. They were appealing to things like skin color and DNA or the species that they're a part of. So I'm not appealing to any of these natural facts. I'm appealing to moral facts, non-natural facts, facts like the property of having a right to continued existence, the right, something that a person would have. And so that's the importance of my personhood argument. Because if we go down the arguments that were presented today, when it, the first argument was that it's never permissible to violate human rights or to violate someone's human rights. Well, this claim is, there's a functional equivalent of it on mine, that it's never permissible to violate the rights of a person unless there's pro tanto conflicts of interest with other duties that we would have to persons. The future person argument I also don't think works because of what's called the non-identity problem. So you could say, well, if this person was aborted and this person, or if they weren't, it would have been better if they hadn't been aborted. Well, that doesn't work because the person that's aborted in one of those situations does not contain anything morally relevant. All we've introduced is non-moral concepts. So when we compare a life that doesn't exist to one that does exist, obviously the one that does exist has something that's more morally relevant because the other one didn't have anything morally relevant. And these differences are not going to be found by some scientific experiment. And so we can easily see that, you know, concerns about justice or injustice to killing of people, we can understand that in terms of persons. We don't have to use this concept of human being. In fact, that's going to become a huge problem when AI takes off and we start having other beings that have these rights, that have these properties that are morally relevant. Perhaps non-human animals, previous Homo sapiens, or like Neanderthals, perhaps they had these rights too. So I'm avoiding this species, this arbitrariness problem by trying to understand a concept of personhood. That when we go through all of these arguments, we realize that by avoiding this philosophically important concept of a person, we've made a mistake in all of these arguments. And so the last thing I want to close with is, what if I'm wrong? What if there is a right to life? What if a prenatal human being is a person? The argument that I gave with the violinist is meant to show that the right to life does not entail the right to someone else's body. And so this is meant to show that there must be at least some abortions that are morally permissible, because there are cases such as rape, an endangerment to the woman's life, or failed contraception, in which a woman's right to autonomy would clearly trump someone else's right to life. And I'll go ahead and end there.
All right, thank you, Ben. All right, thank you, Dr. Kaiser and Ben. This has been an episode of Intellectual Conservatism, a discussion on the ethics of abortion. I want to thank both of our guests. And just to remind the audience that Intellectual Conservatism is now a podcast. The link will be in the description on YouTube. It's a Facebook page, and there's a Patreon account. So, you know, in order to keep the message going of intellectual conservatism, please consider becoming a patron. I want to thank the guests today so much for their contributions. Guys, I just hope that you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Happy Halloween to everyone.
Yeah.
Or All Saints Day, depending on, you know, who you are.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Kaiser. In all seriousness, though, this was a great discussion, and I consider it an honor to be able to sit across from you and exchange ideas. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy we had a chance to talk about this, and I hope this isn't our last conversation.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I would love to do it again.
We can maybe talk about an issue that is more in your wheelhouse, because I don't publish in philosophy of religion, but I have views about it. So, you know, might be
awesome. Oh man, now you got me really excited.
I'll be happy to host again.
Okay.
All right.
Excellent.
All right. Hey guys. So actually after the original recording ended, we actually got into a really good conversation. So I just wanted to ask some questions again. Dr. Kaiser and Ben were talking about the fetal syndrome argument. What is it? Is that what it's called? The fetal alcohol syndrome.
That's right. I could say it just so it's out there so people kind of remember. But it's basically the idea that that it's wrong to intentionally give a human being in utero fetal alcohol syndrome. So let's say a woman's like, and this is not the case normally, right? I hope there's no woman out there who's like, I want to cause this in the unborn. But the idea would be, imagine somebody who said, I'm going to drink a fifth of Jack Daniels every night in order to bring about fetal alcohol syndrome. So it seems to me, at least, that is very seriously wrong. So then the second part is that what I call the impairment principle, and that's the idea that if it's wrong to impair an individual to a particular degree, it's wrong to impair an individual to a greater degree. So for instance, if it's wrong for me to poke out one of your eyes, it's wrong for me to poke out both your eyes. If it's wrong for me to cut off your hand, it's wrong for me to cut off your arm. And so it seems to me at least that killing an individual is a greater impairment than giving that individual fetal alcohol syndrome, because total destruction of your body is worse than just having physical deformities. Having no social life at all is worse than having social problems. Having no mental ability at all is worse than having some mental disability. Being unable to do anything is worse than being unable to count or tell time. So a fortiori, it's worse to kill an individual than to impair that individual to a lesser degree. So I would say it's never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly give an individual fetal alcohol syndrome. And then the other premise would be the impairment principle. It's never morally permissible, if it's never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly give an individual fetal alcohol syndrome, then other things being equal, it's never morally permissible to bring about the greater harm of killing the individual. So the conclusion would be it's never morally permissible to knowingly and willingly authorize someone to kill an individual, in this case, the prenatal human being. So that's sort of the argument, just to remind people of the argument.
Yeah, and then, and this is not me putting words in Ben's mouth, right? But Dr. Kaczor posed the scenario. Suppose that a child is so damaged over the course of the mother's action that this child ends up, let's say, the child's 10 years old now, but because of the damage has a cognitive spectrum, let's say, of someone who's maybe 2 months old, right? Would it be permissible to kill them even at that point? And Ben said yes, to be logically consistent. Is that fair, Ben?
Well, so yes,
Yeah.
so it would be more similar to the situation where we had someone who was in a persistent vegetative state, in which they weren't capable of conscious thought, they had no desire or impulse toward continued life, so they would basically be wriggling around like a worm, if at all, in this situation. And so that yeah, it would be morally permissible to in that life. But then there's also the concept of a factor of safety, and is that gonna, is this something that we're willing to eat up our factor of safety on? Because it's certainly one of the more extreme cases where you have extenuating circumstances here. So yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah, and then to go back to so I think the main thing here is, as we're talking about personhood, there is that question about arbitrariness. And I guess that's going to be like a really important question, right? Adjudicating who has the more arbitrary position, so to speak, such that would count theoretically against that person. Does that make sense? I think, Ben, you were talking in the end as if this were kind of like a scientific hypothesis in a way. So we're kind of assessing who has
an explanatory hypotheses and theories. So I think that it's arbitrary to cut the concept of personhood off at human being. I think trying to make human being the morally relevant property is where the unacceptable arbitrariness comes in.
Yeah.
Well,
whereas I don't find the vagueness of the predicate person problematic, just like I don't find the vagueness of the predicate life to be problematic in biology. I think it's something that we can use methods to overcome.
Dr. Kaczor. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess if you claim that all human beings are persons, that's my view, that leaves open a wide variety of positions about who else would have rights. So my view is all human beings deserve basic human rights. And I don't think it's some radical view. It's the view that's stated in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It's the view that almost everyone says. It's only in the case of abortion that suddenly there's a big exception, except for abortion. Even in the US law condemns killing a fetus. If I see a pregnant woman, kill her and kill her unborn child, I'm charged with double murder, as happened with the husband of Lacey Peterson, who killed them both and is now in jail for double murder. A unborn child can inherit property. So in all cases outside of abortion, it is a crime to intentionally kill the human being prior to birth. So we kind of carve out this arbitrary exception. So my view would be something like this. All human beings deserve basic human rights. And then for me, it's a totally open question whether there are other individuals who also deserve basic respect. And maybe there are. Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe there are aliens on wherever that will come to, we'll have contact with them, and they also would deserve basic respect. I mean, I'm open to that.
But they wouldn't be human. So by
Right.
virtue of what property would make them a person? That's the question.
That's right. Yeah. So again, I want to avoid. I think using the term person is a mistake. So I don't want to.
But how's it a mistake there? So we're saying that. So we find an alien, and it's not human.
Right.
But it has rights. Why does it have rights, but we don't? We can't answer that question without appealing to personhood.
I'm not. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure about that. I mean, if you think of the concept of personhood, used as a being that deserves respect or a being that deserves some sort of due care, this is a modern concept, right? In other words, they had, even in the time of Aristotle, the idea, now they didn't call it personhood, but the idea that certain individuals deserved respect. So I don't know if I have to, I guess to answer your question, you'd have to come up with a meta theory about, well, what is it that gives individuals respect? And then it seems to me you'd have different views depending on what your broader ethical view was. So if you are a utilitarian, you might have one view. If you're a Kantian, you might have a different view. If you're an Aristotelian, you might have a third sort of view. I don't think we need to get into the kind of meta philosophy about all to answer the question of abortion or infanticide. So that's why I'm just sort of punting on it.
If I could ask then, so when I was originally raising kind of my question to Ben about arbitrariness, I was saying something like I was worried that like Ben's perspective seemed to be outcome driven, where it's like we will construct the conception of personhood that leads to the outcome that already seems to be in the background that we want to get. Does that make sense? So it seems as if we're simultaneously constructing our conception of personhood and trying to get the outcome we want at the same time. And
So
don't worry, Ben. Hold on, real quick.
Oh, sorry.
No. Yeah, don't worry. And then it seems like for me, Dr. Kaiser's position, and I should be, charitable, because when I said it was more simple, what I meant was something like, it does seem more simple to just say a human being is a person. Like all human beings are persons, all human beings, qua human being, have value, whatever. And it seems like, Dr. Kaiser, you were defending kind of maybe a negative thesis in that you were saying, look, this is the simplest conception of quote unquote personhood that's possible. It doesn't run into the same kind of problems that happen, intuitively speaking, when we apply it to other cases, right? It seems as if you were kind of narrowing, it seems like, to put like a picture, it's like you're narrowing down with these reflective equilibrium thought experiments, perhaps, what we should consider a person. And you're saying, at least this definition that you offer doesn't run into as many problems. So it's like you're narrowing it down. Is that?
But the whole time, yeah. I mean, the entire discussion. Maybe we can play back the tape and see. I don't think I've ever said I define person as X, Y, or Z. I'm deliberately not doing that. Mm-hmm. All the arguments I gave, all 6 arguments, none of them have the term person in them.
Yeah.
Like very famously, the future like ours argument, he says in his article, I am not taking any stand on whether or not it's a person. It's irrelevant. The future like ours argument is saying the reason it's wrong to kill you and me is that killing you and me deprives you and me of our future, a future like ours. So that property, having a future like ours, unless we're killed, is a property shared by a newborn and a property shared by the fetus. It's just not about personhood. So again, I think
so it sounds like our disagreement is that I think this question turns on personhood, but it turns for you on life. When life begins, the human being begins, and that's where the
well, I would say that I agree with you about simply the scientific fact that a life begins at this point, the scientific fact that this is a human life. I agree with you. That doesn't determine the abortion issue. So I bring in other moral premises like all human beings deserve human rights. That's a moral premise, right? People say, no, I think some human beings don't deserve human rights. And you mentioned...
So, but you say all human beings deserve human rights. So what about just a right in general, why does it have to be a human right? Why can't it just be a right?
I guess it could be. I mean, I guess they use the
So,
term human rights because
yeah,
that's
that's
the
what
term
I'm
people
asking.
use.
Because
Yeah,
then we say human beings have certain rights. Well, aliens might have certain rights. Obviously, aliens wouldn't have human rights. So what I'm getting at is the concept of person allows us to have this universality, but the concept of human being just doesn't, because the human being is limited to our species, whereas the concept of person is more universal. It could apply to an alien, to an
that's
AI
right.
consciousness.
That's right. So I think it needlessly complicates an already complicated question by bringing in aliens and how we would adjudicate how they're whatever. I think, again, that needlessly complicates things, and people have different intuitions about those kinds of things. So that's why, I'm limiting it to, I think the common way of talking about it as human rights. And I think there's a wide consensus that even severely disabled human beings still have basic human rights. And again, it sounds like your view isn't that you would say, no, if you're severely disabled, have severe cognitive impairment, then you are like a corpse. Fair enough. But I think there's some plausibility to saying, well, no, even if you are severely cognitively impaired, you in fact are not a corpse, because to be a corpse, you have to be dead. In fact, you're a living human being. And that's why, in fact, you would disagree, it sounds like, but almost everyone else would agree that to rape a woman who has severe cognitive impairment is very seriously morally wrong. To just take her organs out and give them to someone else is very seriously morally wrong. And to kill her, maybe when she has a living will that says, I do not want to be killed if I'm in this situation, I would say is very seriously morally wrong. But anyway, the future like ours argument has nothing to do with personhood. The fetal alcohol syndrome argument has nothing to do with, so none of the things I put forward have to do with personhood. And that was deliberate, because I again, we could, if you want to, talk about how I define a person, but I've deliberately up to this point not said that, because again, I think that raises all sorts of things. Now
I think that's a good point, because I think that helps demarcate our disagreement pretty well. Because I would say that it's just essential that we just can't avoid the concept of person, but you're intentionally avoiding it. So
yeah,
I think that helps contrast our views actually really well.
Yeah, so maybe two things real quick. And by the way, how long do you guys have?
I don't have very much longer. I do have a Halloween party to go to.
I don't want to keep you from that.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So Ben, maybe 10 more minutes.
Let's do 5.
Five,
that
sure.
Way it'll be about 5:30. Yeah.
Okay. So then, my question is to Dr. Kaczor, or even to Ben, perhaps. I mean, it seems like, at least from my assessment of the debate, it seems as if Ben can get these might be hard for me and you, Dr. Kaczor, to swallow, but he can, bite the bullet, so to speak, and say, well, logically, yeah, this is how, infanticide becomes permissible, and perhaps a 10-year-old with a cognitive capacity of a 2-month-old is not, whatever, a moral subject. It seems as if I think Ben is correct that we at some point need to get down to the brass tacks of, what is a person? And that's why I use the analogy of the bucket. And I said, what gets you in the bucket, what takes you out of the bucket, and so forth. I mean, would you agree, Dr. Kaczor, or do you think your arguments without engaging personhood can still do the job?
Well, I think that, yeah, I think you don't need to invoke the term personhood to have an argument against abortion. So, yeah. Now, is it helpful? Maybe, but I'm not sure it really is helpful. But yeah, I don't think you need the term in order to have a moral argument. Because in other words, I don't think you need to answer the question about abortion. I don't think you need to raise other questions that we know even less about, like aliens and AI machines. And I mean, it seems really weird to say, well, we've got this question, we disagree, so let's speculate about something we know even less about, and then somehow this will shed light on this. It's sort of moving from the difficult and trying to solve that by speculating about the even more difficult. So I just don't think that's very helpful.
All right, Ben, do you have thoughts on that? On either my question or Dr. Kaczor's response?
So I think that it's with the concept of person is there whether we use that term or not. So, the label person we might be able to leave out, but when Dr. Kaczor is using the term human being, the concept of personhood is there. because he's making the substantive moral claims like, all human beings are deserving of rights. So he's attributing to human beings the properties that I would attribute persons. And so I would insist that the concept of a human being is what's misleading here because of the is-ought gap. Because the human being is a term that we come to understand through the natural sciences and empirical methods. We aren't understanding human being in the terms of moral philosophy and using the concepts of things like properties of a continued right to existence. And that's the property I think that matters. And I don't think that we can just assign that arbitrarily to human beings to court.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think other things could have that property. And so it's I'm speculating about aliens and other AI, but the reason I'm doing that is to show that that the concept of a person is potentially much broader than just human being. It might include, Homo habilis and Neanderthals and, things like that, our ancestors that we ate, that are now extinct. They might have had this property. They weren't human beings. So that's the arbitrariness that worries me, not so much the vagueness predicate that we find like, in a pile, or, like, hey, where do we draw the line? Yeah, these answers might be imprecise in certain ways, but that imprecision is something that we have methods and techniques to deal with.
Yeah, okay. So then let me ask this last question, and don't worry, it's not going to take long. Would you guys be willing to do a part 2 sometime in the future?
I'm definitely willing.
Yeah, I'd be willing to do that. I mean, I feel like we've kind of gone over everything, and I feel in a way we're kind of...
I'd like to do the philosophy of a religion one. I'd really
going over everything.
Interested. Yeah.
Well, we can, but I have to warn you, I am a total amateur. So,
that's fine. Yeah.
It'd be like, whatever, having a fencing match with somebody who's like,
So I'm a big fan of just discussion. Like debates, I think are good to watch, but like having just open philosophical discussion where you're not trying to score points and fence, like you're saying, like, oh man, I just live for those discussions.
Yeah, well, that I'm certainly willing to do. I guess for me, this topic should be obvious to you guys. It has an existential bite, you might say, that I really feel it. Whereas God's existence, like I think God exists, and if I don't debate it properly, God will still exist and isn't really, in a sense, there's less on the line.
No, I totally know what you mean. You don't feel that existential force to have the right answer for the right reasons right now.
Yeah, or at least it's different, it seems to me.
I totally know what you mean.
Yeah.
All right, guys, this was super fun.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta go dress up like a kangaroo for my wife now.
All right.
So
all right. See you later, Ben.
You'll take it easy. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ben. Good. Appreciate it.